In this video, I want to talk about the scam called whiteness. Biologically speaking, there is no such thing as white people. Whiteness, from biological point of view, are recessive genes that are working in the descendants of those who don't produce skin color. They're still human beings just like the rest of the human population, but not all their genes are activated. If they live in cold regions, other genes may be more active, which makes their bodies adaptable to a cold environment. So they will have an advantage in cold areas. While if they would be plucked out of those cold areas and put in the Sahara Desert or some tropical region, they may experience much difficulty and they may even get sick quicker than other human beings. Why? Because their bodies are adapted throughout the generations to live in colder areas. Blonde hair, blue eyes, those are recessive genes. Now what's a recessive gene? A recessive gene is a gene where not all the information is active. The gene is there, but it's not activated. Okay? To know more about genes, you can talk to a professional biologist. He or she can tell you all about it. I just highlighted this to point out that this idea of whiteness as a special mark is a hoax. I'm not saying that people with no skin color are inferior. I never said that. I just explained already. They have their advantage in their geographical regions. Okay? Just like the Kenyan has his advantage in his region. Okay? Now look. Why is this scam of whiteness promoted? I'm going to give an example to you, and I'm going to use the example of the Chinese Empire. During the ancient Chinese Empire, the imperial court demanded payment from all the other nations that lived outside of the Chinese Empire. How are you going to achieve this? How are you going to achieve demanding tax from people who are not part of your administration? It works like this. You convince them that the light-skinned Chinese folks have some kind of superiority with them. You achieve this by only appointing light-skinned Chinese people in positions of power throughout the Chinese Empire. And any time a trader or a diplomat goes overseas, you make sure it's a light-skinned Chinese individual. It can be that the light-skinned Chinese people are a very tiny minority within the Chinese Empire. It can be that there are only around 1.5 million light-skinned Chinese people of the 60 million that live within the Chinese Empire. So that's a very tiny minority. And many of those light-skinned Chinese folks are also poor and uneducated. But because you have this Apollonistic rule in which you worship the white man, you make sure that light-skinned Japanese people are seen everywhere. And that they are seen with silver and gold and multiple wives. In short, you make sure they're seen with advantages. And you send out migrants to live in those foreign countries or those foreign islands. And you make sure that only light-skinned Chinese folks are shipped to those regions. What happens then is that all the nations outside the Chinese Empire who are close, so all the nations in Asia, will associate white Chinese folks with wealth, with riches, and with prosperity. So now, the princes or the chieftains that lead those nations, they want to be associated with wealth, prosperity. They want to be associated with advantages. So they now will favor those light-skinned Chinese folks. And some of them may even want their daughters to marry light-skinned Chinese men or their sons to marry light-skinned Chinese women. And that's how you achieve that folks think that light-skinned Chinese folks have some kind of superiority with them. And that associate with them makes you share in that specialty. well, it's all a hoax. That's how this whole thing of white supremacy or racism works. You have a minority on the earth, which are people without skin color, but you don't want the world's population to know that they're just a minority. You want the world's population to think that they are the majority and that they own most of the wealth of the earth. Well, that's not true. So how do you achieve this? You make sure that throughout your empire, that only people without skin color are at the top. But those people at the top may be actors. They may not be the actual ones running the show, but you make sure they're the ones seen. It's important that they are seen all the time and associated with power, strength, wealth, beauty, kindness, joy, happiness, a sound mind. That's what you want them to be associated with. And you make sure that at the same time, everyone that's the opposite of it is treated as bad as possible. If you do this repeatedly, people will begin to associate people without skin color with some kind of superiority, and automatically they'll perceive everyone who is not quote-unquote white as having an issue, as being ugly, or as being less of a human being. So it's a psychological operation. There is, biologically speaking, no such thing as whiteness. White people is a term you use to categorize a group of people. And there's nothing wrong with using a term to categorize a group of people, but the term itself doesn't actually exist. White people. It doesn't. You have to convince people it's a real thing so that they can feel special. This is how it works. Or let me say, this is how it worked in history. In the 19th century, when this whole thing of racism became institutionalized, the nations in Europe, because you had new nations formed, though the economic reset that happened during the rule of Napoleon, well, it was the Napoleon era. Not that Napoleon really ruled everything, but you get the idea here. During that time, let's say in 1815, after the Napoleon era ended, you had new structures, new countries in Europe. And you still have those blue blood dynasties that ruled, assisted by the black nobility, with a shadow government covering both of them. You had the Industrial Revolution going on, which meant that railways were laid throughout Europe, and also in the colonies, in the so-called colonies, or the overseas territories. You also had people losing their importance, like horse breeders lost their importance because now you had trains. So there was a big change going on, and this change was in a disadvantage of the majority of the people. Okay? Because the railways were constructed in such a way that the industrialists who were capitalists got the best advantage. You don't want the population to realize that the changes that are going on is at their expense. So you convince them through literature, through imagery, through theater, that they are special. And by enforcing this special status through propaganda, the people will cleave onto it, because human beings have the need to be important. They have the need to be significant. So once you have the population, in this case the population without the skin color, feeling significant, they now will defend this significance. And while defending this significance, they won't notice that they are being scammed by their own leaders. You get it? Now, outside of Europe, or outside of the places that were inhabited by people without skin color, it worked like this. You had those other regions which were exploited economically at the expense of the folks around there, and at the same time, you had those men without skin color in suits placed in multiple places at the top. Often they were just actors, but they are seen at the top. So people over time began to associate stability with white people, with whiteness. So everyone that wanted to be stable had to get in line with the white folks. That's the illusion that was created. The truth was that those actors who were the governors, the military leaders, they were dependent on the majority of the world's population, which are plain black folks with woolly hair, which have no trace of whiteness at all. But because those white actors were seen as the saviors of civilization, because this has been repeated time and time again, the world's population began to believe it, even though it's not true at all. And now that the world's population fell for it, and throughout generations they established thinking patterns and behavioral patterns in societies based on this hoax, they now have a difficult time acknowledging that it's just a hoax. Because if they have to acknowledge that whiteness is a hoax, that means that the whole structure of their society and everything they've been conditioned into has to be examined. And if they have to examine it, then they need to realize, hold on a minute, we've been exploited. We people without skin color, we've been exploited by our own people in very brutal and very inhumane manners. So where's our special status? Where's our so-called white privilege? And for those outside of Europe or outside of the United States or Australia, it works like this, that they have been conditioned into a victim mentality, and that even in the societies this victim mentality is reflected. So now they need to face that collective victim mentality. And they also need to face this compensation-seeking disorders that they developed collectively, in which they favor people that look like white folks. Because in many black families, in black communities, children who have a lighter skin are treated with much favor. They are the golden child. They are pampered with advantages just for the fact that their skin is lighter. It can happen that you have a baby and the skin tone is a bit darker than the other baby you have. There's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean it's not up from the same father. Such things can happen. But it happens in black communities, and they shouldn't happen, but it happens that children with lighter skin are treated better than their siblings. And often there's one sibling who has the darkest tone of the skin is treated harsh as a scapegoat. They're treated dirty. There's even this believer told me that at a crash, at a daycare, in English called a daycare, where parents don't build children because they need to go to work, the nurses are very playful with the kids. If it's a so quote-unquote white kid, the nurses have difficulty giving it away to the parents. They often talk a lot with the parents. But if it's a black kid, or a kid that deviates much from the white idol, which is Apollo, they tend to just give the kid away without any affection at all. And this is unconscious behavior. The nurses aren't really aware they're doing it, but nevertheless they're doing it. It's their conditioning manifesting in their behavior. Whiteness is a scam that the pagan rulers of this world introduced. First of all, they worship Apollo, a white Nephilim, so they ought to give praise to their gods by reflecting this in society. That's one reason, but the second reason is, by convincing the majority of the world's population that they are trash, they now can use this state of anxiety into triggering the world's population into seeking compensation. And in triggering the world's population into seeking compensation, they don't need a big military to control everyone. They don't even need an RFID chip to put into everyone's right arm or in the forehead, like some pagan churches tell you. The only thing they need is for people to accept the image of the beast, which is Apollo, reflected as the white man. And once people have the image of the beast in their minds, they automatically are trapped mentally by the compensation seeking that comes in the name of the white man. So the mark of the beast implies a mentality. Okay? And this mark of whiteness is what the pink rulers use to rule the whole world. So whiteness is a scam. Don't fall for it. Be at peace.